Center, Sentinel, and other publications on Somalia, as well as Nigeria and the Sahel. And finally, we have Bulama Bukharti, who is a Tony Blair Institute Senior Fellow, a Ridgway Foundation Vice President of Programs, and the author of a new book, Inside Boko Haram, Unraveling the Myths of an African Catastrophe. I myself am the moderator today. I am Jacob Zen. I'm a non-resident fellow at OPI, and I too have focused primarily in Nigeria, and I wrote the book Unmasking Boko Haram, and I continue to edit several publications and academic works related to security and stability on the continent. For the members of the audience, if you have any questions throughout the panel, please send them through the chat function, and we will address the questions either during the interventions, if appropriate, or in a Q&A session after the interventions. Now, without further ado, let me begin by introducing the intervention of Daisy, who will discuss external actors and their impact on the volatile geopolitical context in Africa today. Daisy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jacob. So much of my focus right now is going to be on external actors that are newly emerging, that are expanding their footprint in African internal conflicts. So largely be focused on the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Russia, as well as China. So for almost 3 decades, external actors that were intervening in African conflict states, as well as those states that are in crisis, were limited to Western governance, multinational organizations such as the UN or the European Union, even African Union. There was also the neighboring African states that would intervene either through the regional economic communities or bilaterally, or we'd have private military companies from Western states and South African countries. So generally, that was the state of play. But in recent years, we're seeing an increase in both direct and proxy interventions in conflict-affected states by Emirati, Turkish, Russian, and Chinese actors. Initially, their influence, particularly for the UAE, Turkey, and Russia, was more pronounced in Eastern and Northern Africa, but we've seen a rapid expansion both westward and southwards in recent periods. And with this new expansion, there's a need to examine where they have intervened, why they have intervened in terms of what are their motives, and the impacts that they're having on conflict dynamics in the region. In terms of where they intervened, I will acknowledge that what I'm going to give is not an exhaustive list, but I'll try to capture the areas where they have been most active in recent periods. So for the United Arab Emirates, we see their influence in Ethiopia, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan. In Turkey, Ethiopia, Libya, and Somalia. Maybe with some interest in expanding also towards the Sahel in recent periods. In Russia, we're seeing the interventions in the CAR, Libya, Mali, Mozambique, and Sudan. Whereas China, what we're seeing in terms of weapon support, as well as where we're seeing the private military contractors present, expands both the North Africa, West Africa, the South, the East, and Central. But in terms of the countries that have received both private military as well as arms support across the continent, we've seen their presence mostly in Djibouti, Sudan, Ethiopia, Central African Republic, Tanzania, Angola, and Mali. Now, there's a question about whether or not these interventions have been covert or not. For many of these interventions, they have tried to maintain some level of covertness or some sort of plausible deniability in how they're intervening, or have in some way sought to minimize their state's official military footprint. We see this most notably for Russian government that has remained generally ambiguous regarding the status and mission of Russian forces. In the Central African Republic, they generally describe themselves as official military instructors, whereas in Mali, they have dismissed them as private contractors acting without government approval. In Libya, it has refused to acknowledge their presence to a certain extent. But in reality, you see that these forces have engaged in combat and have been supplied by the Russian military aircraft as well. At the same time, these activities by Russian on the continent have been closely linked to profit-making enterprises that were associated with the now deceased Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was a former founder of the Wagner Group. For the UAE, on their side, they have failed to acknowledge its responsibility for drone strikes in areas such as Libya and Ethiopia, as well as other violations of the UN arms embargoes to Libya. Turkey's side has generally operated or intervened openly, though we can certainly mention that it has remained silent about its initial campaign of drone strikes in Libya in 2020, as well as on its responsibility for deploying Syrian mercenaries to the country. China, on its part, has used private military companies and has generally operated openly. There's conversations about whether it's private companies functioning on the fringes of international law, especially when it comes to them being able to carry weapons and how they sometimes may creatively skirt that ability to do so. Now that we understand where they've intervened, there's a question about why they have intervened. What are their motives? And generally, we can break down their motives into several factors. One of the main factors being rivalries. A key driver behind these new external actors' forays into African conflicts is their engagement in rivalries with other powers, and African states then served as one amongst multiple theaters for engaging in these rivalries. Notably, this is among Gulf states. You see this, whether it is in Sudan between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and trying to set up their activities there, whether it's between the United Arab Emirates or Qatar and by extension Turkey in places like Somalia, or the United Arab Emirates and Turkey in Libya. So these rivalries have sort of manifested in interesting ways across the continent. For Russia, its interventions in areas such as the Central African Republic, Libya, and Mali have arguably been designed to curb the influence of Western powers, particularly France. For Turkey, is recent sort of foray into the Sahel, whether through its soft power as well as its more hard power efforts, sort of establishing agreements with different countries in the region, you can see that this has sort of created some tensions and concerns amongst Europeans in the region. So there's certainly these tensions. For China, it's very clear that, based on perceptions of the looming power shift between the rising East and South and the declining West and North, China sees its efforts as part of proactively shaping the global environment to allow for its ascendance. So the aim is to challenge US hegemonic position, and from a security and military power posture stance, Africa serves as a possible path through which China could, disturb or divert attention from the United States in the region. And so you see this in its ability to build bases in Djibouti, expand its network of defense attaches in Africa, increase its defense sales, invest in African ports as a, potential future naval deployment structures, provide professional military education and training, deepen its security ties with local law enforcement, and a wealth of other activities, including, financially supporting peacekeeping troops and also deploying its own troops in the region. There's also economic drivers. You see this a lot for Turkey explicitly, and you see this as part of its strategic goals, as it's stated. United Arab Emirates also sees maritime security and investment in port infrastructure in places like the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, as well as agricultural investments in Ethiopia and Sudan as a way to sort of bolster its food security. Russia, perhaps you can argue, sort of less so, having a lot of substantial financial interests, but though these substantial financial interests are lacking, they do get access to mining opportunities through the incentives of the Wagner operations. China, on its part, sees its military engagement as part of its efforts to advance its economic and strategic interests, particularly its Belt and Road initiatives. And you see this manifesting in a number of ways that I can discuss later on. A third factor for why they've engaged is a growing Western reluctance to commit foreign interventions using ground forces and a continued trend within Western countries to minimize the risk exposure through remote warfare. And so, leaving aside 2011 war in Libya, Western military interventions in Africa during the past decade have been narrowly conceived as counterterrorism operations. And, there's also been this aim, with the exception of Mali and France, to limit their footprint on the ground. So this has sort of created opportunities for organizations such as the Wagner Group through Russia to sort of step in. And the last one is, one of the last two factors is the low political and financial costs that sometimes intervening provides, particularly for organizations for countries like Russia, the UAE, and even Turkey, right? They're able to minimize the political risks of the interventions at home, but also limit the financial costs of intervening by sometimes using private companies. And the last one is, exploiting dependence of local partners. And this is largely, you can see this a little bit with, with Russia's interventions in some of these regions, right? The new interveners exploit the dependencies of local partners who were internationally isolated or had different mobilizing Western support. So this went for Mali and Sudanese juntas, where the government of dubious legitimacy, such as Libya's, sort of what we see in Libya, for instance, sort of may lack some of the status that they need internationally, but may still receive some sort of external support. Lastly, and very quickly, I'll try to wrap up in terms of what impact they've had on the conflict dynamics in these contexts. And often what you're seeing is an exacerbation of violence against civilians. Of course, there's an importance to have a caveat that even when Western states were intervening in some of these regions, you could still see that certain local governments indiscriminate targeting of indiscriminate targeting of civilians was discounted or ignored, or some of these foreign Western troops have been accused of conducting civilian casualties. And so certainly those caveats have to stand, that this is not necessarily a new thing with these new interveners. But that caveat aside, current patterns suggest that the new interveners are either directly promoting or at least facilitating some sort of a shift in tactics that can result in more civilian victims. Examples include drone strikes and airstrikes in Libya and in Ethiopia that have killed dozens of civilians. And you can also talk about Russia's interventions in the Central African Republic and Mali, as well as in Libya, that have been tied to some egregious violations of human rights standards and also resulted in a lot of violence against civilians. There's also arguments made that China's private military company deployments, though they're mostly out there to protect some of their economic investments, because they sometimes collaborate with local militias, they end up basically taking sides in the conflict and could potentially lead to put civilians at risk if they continue to be deployed in such a way. There's also an impact in terms of the balance of power in African conflicts by backing one or opposing sides of the conflict. So these interveners have, had very tangible consequences for balance of powers in African conflicts. A good example is Ethiopia, where you can see that they didn't necessarily were on opposing sides, but when UAE and Turkish drones, with some support from Iranian support, were able to repel the offensive during the Tigrayan war against Addis Ababa. So some of that drone strikes and weapon shipments certainly assisted in sort of tipping the balance in favor of the regional, the government in Ethiopia. In Libya, however, you see that there's a taking of two sides between Khalifa Haftar's Libyan Arab armed forces based in Benghazi that are supported by the UAE and Russia, as well as the government of national accord based in Tripoli that is supported by Turkey. And we saw this all throughout the lead up to the clashes in the UAE providing covert support to General Haftar in 2014, similarly with Russia providing that support. And, as Haftar's offensive on Tripoli went underway, you saw a reaction by Turkey stepping in to support the government of national accord. And so you can see these tensions existing, and though there's some efforts on both Turkey's side and Russia's side to mend fences on the two opposing sides of the conflict, these tendencies still exist and create tensions. Within the Central African Republic, you also see the impact of Russia and Wagner forces presence in terms of empowering the regional government present there. And you can see that, although both Russia and the Central African Republic refer to these forces as instructors, they have been used in combat on numerous occasions, allowing the current president to repel rebel offensives and expand his authority. In Somalia, you also saw a similar backing of two different sides, particularly during the Gulf Cooperation Council crisis, where the UAE began to feel that the regional administration or the federal government of Farmajo was getting too close to Qatar and by extension Turkey. And as a result, started to up its support for different regional governments in the area, known as federal member states. They also began to build a military base in Bereba in Somaliland. Turkey, on its side, started to support more of the development of the national army and federal government forces, to developing a trained force known as Gogor, as well as a Somali police unit known as Hamad. And so, this involvement and creating of multiple different forces, and as well as the tensions between the UAE and the federal government at the time, led to some increasing loggerheads between units trained by Turkey and UAE during this particular time, tumultuous political time in Somalia. We can go on and on with examples from Sudan, for instance, with the support with the Gulf states supporting different sides of the conflicts, with the rapid support forces supported by the UAE as well as Russia, and the Sudan armed forces supported by Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and concerns that this may create another Libya situation where you have sort of two multiple centers of power in a fragmented state. I don't want to go too long. I know there's so many deep examples you can go into, but I'm happy to talk more about anything that may come up in terms of questions. I'll sort of end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daisy, for this broad overview of the impact of external actors in Africa today. That was very comprehensive. And now we're going to hone in a little bit more on the Sahel, and I invite James Barnett to chime in on the coup contagion in the Sahel. Is this going to spread? Does this invite more opportunities for Russia through the Wagner Group to become influential in the region, perhaps to negative and detrimental effects? And what are the root causes of these coup contagions, as well as the banditry that continues to plague the Sahelian region?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And great to be here with all these very kind of talented and informative speakers. I think that this is a good topic to kind of parlay out of Daisy's discussion of some of the regional dimensions, because certainly those are at play. I think it's helpful, to try to go through quickly, looking at the kind of coup issues. I think that there's the academic literature is somewhat, I think, conflicted about the extent to which, do coups really happen in waves? Are they kind of primarily driven by internal circumstances or kind of regional dimensions? I think that, the reality is it's always a combination of both. And I try to avoid kind of these academic turf wars. So I would say that, the coup contagion is at least a helpful way of kind of thinking about the different kind of, the periods in which we kind of see as successive coups and the interplay between kind of the domestic and the regional factors. And so I think that kind of on that note, it's worth thinking about, okay, what's different with kind of this recent wave of coups in the Sahel and West Africa more broadly, but honing in really, I think, on Mali, Burkina, and Niger, where the kind of security ramifications are the highest. So, there have been a lot of coups in West Africa historically. There were periods as well, like right after independence in the 1960s. You had, successive waves of coups in West Africa and Africa more broadly. Benin, Dahomey, Guinea, DR Congo, and then Nigeria. And so there was some dimension of kind of, young officers in each of these young nascent militaries, maybe getting some ideas from seeing other countries and stuff. And then you had, kind of another period in the 1990s in West Africa where there were quite a number. So they're not, unfortunately, coups are not rare in the region. But what kind of sets apart, I think, the recent wave of coups since 2020 in the Sahel is kind of three main dimensions. I think on the first hand, kind of the first major issue is that, particularly looking at these three Sahel countries, is that each of these countries that experienced coups, and two coups, successive coups in the case of Mali and Burkina, are also facing what I would argue are close to existential threats in terms of security threats from non-state actors in these countries, in the terms of the kind of jihadist insurgencies, and that these insurgencies or these conflicts are very transnational in nature. So there's a lot of overlap between the dynamics in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, now pushing down into the coastal states and stuff. So you had more similarities in terms of the proximate triggers of the coups, and also the rhetorical and kind of narrative justifications that the putschists gave for executing their coups as kind of being related to the deteriorating regional security situation, the deteriorating security situation in the country. So I think that's that's one of the kind of the first things that set this apart. On the second point, then there's the question of this broader kind of regional and or I would say international kind of dimensions to the conflict, where Daisy mentioned the French-led Operation Barkhane intervention in the Sahel, and this has really proved in kind of it's always been to an extent a controversial intervention in the region, but it's really served as a rallying point for these juntas, which otherwise come in with potentially limited kind of domestic legitimacy, but kind of pointing to the international dimensions of insecurity, insofar as these juntas are blaming, I think, both fairly but also unfairly in many instances, the kind of French intervention and the international, Western-led kind of intervention in the region for the deteriorating security situation. And so kind of a vague form of sovereigntist rhetoric and ideology comes into play. And, because of the kind of the high profile nature of that intervention, particularly in the case of the French, where they really had forces on the ground, they were conducting operations. And of course, given the history of the French, not only the colonial history, but very much this kind of legacy of France-Afrique, of the French kind of heavy interventionist and, I would say kind of meddling behavior in their former colonies, you have a lot of kind of real resentment there against that international kind of dimension of the conflict, that international intervention, even though many of us would argue that, the French were kind of operationally, at least if not strategically, that they were, producing some dividends, that they were helping combat security in some places. Of course, there's a whole debate to be had there. But what you see then is kind of in contrast to the more, I would say, some of the more ideologically oriented, juntas and military officers that were very active in the Cold War and during the kind of liberation struggles in many regions. People think about like Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara and stuff. The current juntas that are taking power don't really have kind of a clear ideology. You can even kind of see this in the fact that the Burkina and the Nigerian juntas both have the same name, same acronym. They're kind of doing this copy paste approach, but the kind of anti-French rhetoric allows them to kind of rally up on that, soak up those sovereigntist tension sentiments, and so that ends up being kind of the flag around which they can rally the population and maintain a bit of domestic legitimacy. And then, of course, that also plays into the question of the foreign influence, right? And so by, breaking ties with France and to some extent maybe the US, it varies from, between Mali, Burkina, and Niger, turning to Russia as an alternative security provider via the Wagner Group becomes a way as well for these, the juntas to still they still have this form of extroversion. They still are somewhat dependent on external military actors, but it allows them to do it because of the wider geopolitical rift between the United States and the West and Russia. It allows them to do it in a way that is kind of like ideologically justified within their own kind of, the parameters that they set. That said, I think it's very important to recognize that Mali, Burkina, and Niger, though they share many similarities and much of the same rhetoric, their policies have actually been different in terms of this question about, the international alignments. Mali is the most extreme case of kind of breaking with France and then very firmly kind of embedding with Russia, inviting in a large Wagner presence that's been very active in the country, committing some horrible human rights abuses, as Daisy admitted. Burkina has actually tread a bit more carefully, I think in part because of maybe the legacy of some Karas politics or whatever. And the junta there, I think, is very careful not to be seen as being too dependent on an external backer, even as politically, they are still cozying up to Russia. But so there's that domestic political dimension. There's also the fact that some of the restrictions that U.S. policy has, on these juntas, the Section 7008 restrictions, the junta in Mali has kind of said to the U.S., we don't care, get out, we're not going to deal with you. And to the U.S., we say, the U.S., we say good riddance as well. Burkina, they've tried to actually maintain a bit more of that cooperation behind the scenes to the extent they can. And then that's very much what we're seeing now in the case of Niger, where I think that the Nigerians are kind of stuck in this position where they're trying to maintain some degree of their security support that they get from the U.S., but now it's complicated because of the coup. And then the final kind of the third point, because I'm cognizant of time here, the third point that I would mention about what sets this apart is we're seeing kind of the ineffectiveness of regional responses. And I would say that, to some extent, I guess that's always been the case insofar as most coups in West Africa historically have not been reversed or overturned. But I think that, what set the coup in Niger apart was this very forceful line that ECOWAS took, spearheaded by Nigeria and President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who's the current chairman of ECOWAS, that, for the first, whereas kind of the previous coups had happened with some kind of delayed responses, some sanctions and stuff, most people were criticizing ECOWAS for not being forceful enough. All of a sudden, kind of ECOWAS chaired by Tinubu comes out after the Niger coup and says, and issues the use of force against the junta if they don't back down. Now, that kind of creates this situation politically, I think, or regionally, where I would say not since kind of the previous wave of coups in the 1990s do you have a dynamic as complex, where you have, transnational security threats. At that point, it was kind of in the context of the Liberian and Sierra Leonean civil wars, the movement of Charles Taylor and RUF, some of the role that Gaddafi played in sponsoring some of these groups and stuff. You have, an ECOWAS trying to take on a much more forceful role and stuff. And so you have the politics of kind of the internal politics of the ECOWAS bloc coming much more to the floor. And then, you have, to an extent, this regional dimension, but I would say actually in the 1990s, since the Cold War had passed, that kind of larger geopolitical dimension wasn't as pronounced as it is now in this era of heightened competition between the West and France. But, what kind of all that being said, I guess I should say, I think that what we really saw with this kind of ECOWAS tough talk and stuff is, in fact, it really underscored the extent to which there aren't easy solutions to addressing this issue of coup contagion. Because as soon as ECOWAS said that, many people were very surprised. And even, those of us who, of course, are opposed to the coups and all of that, immediately there were all these questions about the viability of how is ECOWAS going to put together this force? The standby force doesn't really exist. And all the ECOWAS nations themselves are, for the most part, many of them are dealing with serious internal security issues, Nigeria especially. And I don't think I'll have time to talk about banditry, but I've done many presentations on that. You can look up my writing if you're curious. But that and the jihadist insurgencies and all of that, Nigeria is very bogged down domestically. The intervention was always going to be very unpopular politically within Nigeria, especially given some of the social, political, cultural connections between the northern Nigeria and Niger. And so it kind of became this situation in which ECOWAS, I think, made a threat that they couldn't back up. And then again, the jihadist challenge is compounding everything, because when ECOMOG intervened in Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 1990s, they were intervening into complex civil wars, yes, but it actually ended up being a lot easier for ECOMOG to essentially pick sides in the civil war and kind of align with one set of warlords against another. Whereas that's much harder now because ECOMOG is presumably not going to align with JNM or IS Sahel province, we would hope. And so you have a kind of more complex and volatile regional security situation. So I think I'll end on the last point that I think that even though we've averted what I think would have been a very risky and potentially disastrous kind of regional war over this, once ECOWAS has effectively kind of backed down from that kind of threat of action, and now everything is in this kind of slow, drawn-out diplomatic process of negotiating end to sanctions and a transition back to civilian rule in Niger. We really are looking at a situation of kind of lesser of two evils, and I think that the situation on the whole is still very, very bleak regionally. And what we're seeing is that Niger, which had previously been a very effective, by regional standards, quite an effective counterterrorism partner, in part because the military was, take a bit more calibrated approach to counterinsurgency and stuff. That the military is getting bogged down in politics now in Niamey, and that's we've seen that with some of the recent attacks into Liberi and Tahua region. That the military regime doesn't seem prepared to fulfill its actual national security responsibilities, which of course is entirely unsurprising if you looked at the history of military regimes, be it in West Africa or most other places. So I think I'll end there, and if I have time for the second intervention, maybe I'll talk about the intersection of banditry with some of the jihadist groups in Nigeria. So.
Thank you very much, James. And indeed, if anyone in the audience has questions on banditry or any of the other topics that have been mentioned by the panelists, please send them in the chat. All questions should be able to be answered either during the interventions when there's the appropriate spot or in the Q&A afterwards. So we've covered East and West Africa, including the external factors on the security situation. And now I'd like to turn the floor to Lily Lusada, who will discuss a country that is perhaps often overlooked, and that might be because of its relative success in maintaining security. And that country is Mauritania, where Lily has recently conducted field research. Lily, could you please share with us some insights from your assessment of the violent extremism situation in that country? Thank you.
Yes, can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome, okay. Thank you, Jacob, so much for the introduction, and thanks to OPI for the opportunity to speak alongside excellent panelists. For this intervention, I'm going to speak a little less about formal research and just kind of a country case study from some work as a practitioner. I've just returned from several months in Mauritania, helping design a PVE program there. So I'm going to speak about violent extremism in Mauritania, some of the kind of historic and maybe forward risks and responses. Okay, so give a brief overview for those who may be less familiar. Historically, in the past, from 2005 to 2011, Mauritania was relatively hard hit, first starting by the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, GSPC, which then became AQIM, reaching down from Algeria. I've highlighted a few of those kind of higher profile attacks, but there were a number up until 2011. And then since 2011, Mauritania has not experienced any terrorist attacks. However, there's kind of two-pronged risks still facing the country in terms of VE. The first, which is relatively unique for the region, is a larger amount of kind of ideological, higher level engagement from Mauritanian nationals with VEO groups, particularly AQIM. So just as an example, there's a few names there. Several of the individuals on the US sanctions list at kind of that higher level leadership and long-term engagement with AQIM are Mauritanian nationals. And that's kind of unique compared to other countries where we're seeing maybe more recruitment via kind of foot soldiers as opposed to an economic push factors, as opposed to radicalization and kind of ideological engagement. The second prong, which is more external, is just due to geography. There's obviously a large, over 2,000 kilometers of exposed desert between Mauritania, Algeria to the north, Mali to the east, and then Senegal to the south. So that just kind of brings a factor of exposure to areas that are highly active for various VEO groups, particularly on the border there. You're looking at AQIM, Katibat Messina, and Al-Morbitan, of course, others as well. So within Mauritania, there's kind of a few underlying drivers. I would say that, again, I think it's a relatively unique case just in terms of how many Mauritanians have been engaged at that leadership level with AQIM. And I think one of the drivers there is just that it's a country that comes with a kind of highly conservative religious social fabric. And it's one of the only self-described Islamic republics in North and West Africa. The country is under Sharia law. I don't at all mean to conflate kind of Islam with VE, but specifically for Mauritania is it does allow and practice kind of a high level of highly conservative Islamist groups and a lot of Islamist parties and a large Salafi community. So for that, I think no surprise again that you see kind of engagement at senior leadership levels as opposed to foot soldiers and recruitment from Nouakchott, the capital city, from relatively educated populations as opposed to recruitment across the border. The second, which connects to that, is a long history of kind of Gulfi geopolitical influence, which seeks to deepen that Islamist identity and influence. In particular, that's been through Saudi Arabia. In the 80s and 90s, there were Salafi activists and scholars who received funding and training and kind of cross-study between Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf states, who then returned to Mauritania and preached in urban areas. Saudi Arabia has also historically and to this day contributed significant development funding for establishing mosques as well as conservative Islamic schools. And again, I think that's partly why you see higher level of Nouakchott kind of radicalization as opposed to recruitment. The third factor is, of course, the border region. This is a region with, 90% of the country is sand dune, and it is very vast and difficult to police. And so you have also mobile populations and historic trade routes for licit and increasingly illicit trade between Senegal and Mali. So just lots of movement there. The fourth I put in yellow because it's I think this is kind of the burgeoning driver, which has not historically been as large a part of recruitment and VE within Mauritania, but there is just immense social and racial inequity in the country. It operates as a racial caste system, which really dictates every opportunity that people get. And there's quite a large amount of economic pressure, 60% unemployment rate and 61% youth population. So those are kind of some of the factors. I think what's been unique about Mauritania in some ways has been the response. So there's a few factors I'll just go through. I can't not mention that in 2011, during the US raid on the Osama bin Laden compound, they retrieved several documents that between AQIM and the Mauritanian government that appeared to discuss a de facto kind of non-aggression agreement to the fee of 10 to 20 million euros per year in exchange for no kidnapping and attack of tourists in the country. It's not clear if that accord was reached and the Mauritanian government denies it, but I think it's largely seen to be a credible communication. The other kind of factors that's really interesting and I would say successfully done for Mauritania was a military restructure. There was a revised strategy that had a few components. So first of all, they restructured the military, including additional improved salaries and training and updated doctrine to build the capacity and morale of soldiers in the field. Within that, they also procured change in weaponry to allow them to better reach more remote areas and fight in asymmetric conflict. And they specifically established a nomad group, and within that, these Maharist units, which were smaller and more mobile, embedded kind of border units some of whom the Maharis are on camelback, in order to address the border security or border vulnerability issues and to prevent further instability. In doing so, they established specific crossing points near water points that were deemed kind of checkpoints that they would operate, but otherwise the rest of the border region is considered a military zone. The Nomad group does a few things. They are embedded, like I said, so they collect a lot of human intelligence. They extend the presence of the state and gain trust of the population through things like medical services, digging wells, schools, etc. And they also sedentarized several nomadic areas into a few key towns where they centralized government service provision and security provision. So kind of what you'd think of as like classic, what I feel the US has tried in many places of counterinsurgency response, they've done it in a pretty effective way. I would say uniquely effective for the region. The final two are related to more kind of the political discourse. So they also mobilized official imams and ulema to kind of counter extremist discussions and promote more moderate practice of Islam and televised and publicized kind of those movements. And they also have just flexed their political control muscles on free speech, which has had, of course, some negative implications on kind of human rights, free speech, but has also effectively allowed them to, ban certain political parties or certain discourse that they find to be too extreme. So relatively successful on that. The question is kind of about potential risks and trajectory moving forward, I would say. So from working there and based on how effective their response has been to date, I think it's unlikely to see a protracted insurgency or to see any insurgent group gain territory. However, I think that the question that faces Mauritania is basically, if given the number of social pressure points and economic pressure points facing the country, whether or not the recruitment rhetoric and tactics will be able to shift from what was traditionally more just anti-Western and kind of Islamist into increasingly leveraging the social grievances, which are very intense in the country, as well as the worsening economic conditions. And if things are able to shift effectively that way, and I've seen some initial studies that that may be happening, the question is whether or not the government would have a way to shift its tactics to address those issues. So I'll stop there because we're short on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. We really appreciate that inside snapshot into the Mauritanian scene, with some successes, but also some potential risks and drawbacks. Now I'd like to turn the floor to Boulama Boukarti, who will similarly provide an inside snapshot into the situation in Uganda and the DRC and his work on de-radicalization and rehabilitation there. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for moderating this and for your kind introduction. Daisy, Lily, very nice to meet you, and James, very good to see you again. Thank you to OPI for hosting this important conversation at a time when all of us are distracted, quite rightly, with other issues across the world. I'm going to just give us an overview of what Bridgeway Foundation, of which I am Vice President of Programs, is doing in Uganda and the DRC, as Jacob said. I am going to hone in on one of the three main activities we do, but I just want to give us an overview of the activities. First is for us to understand that the group we are focusing on mostly at Bridgeway in Eastern Africa or East Central Africa, Congo, Uganda, is the Allied Democratic Forces that is now calling itself the Islamic State in the Central African Republic. It's a group that has been existing since the early 90s and has seen different kinds of metamorphoses in terms of its motivations and its partners or allies, which then pledged allegiance to ISIS in 2018. And since then, we saw a huge spike in the group's area of operation, as well as fatalities and number of fighters. For example, in 2017, in the first 6 months of 2017, the ADF did not kill anyone. It was a group that was nearly dead. In the second 6 months of 2017, it killed 61 people. 61 is too many, but when we see the upsurge after 2018, when it pledged allegiance to ISIS, from 2018 to date, it has killed 4,650 at least people. Its area of operation has expanded from 1,700 square kilometers to over 10,000 square kilometers from the Beni or southern Ituri territory to the North Kivu territory to the southern Ituri territory in eastern Congo. It has since 2018 launched 10 attacks outside Congo, in Uganda, in Rwanda, attempted attacks in Tanzania. So it's a group that is expanding not just within Congo, but also becoming a sub-regional threat in that region. And it is the group Bridgeway Foundation is mostly focusing on. For our activities, we focus on 3 main areas. Number 1 is our project aimed at defunding the group, ensuring that we help towards cutting the group's finances, because no group can operate without finances. And since its allegiance to ISIS, we have seen inflow of a lot of money from Somalia to Uganda and Congo for the activities of the ADF or the Islamic State in the Congo. And so our defunding, our first activity is defunding the group. The second is defection messaging, and the third is DDR, which is de-radicalization, rehabilitation, and reintegration. In defunding the group, what we are mainly doing is employing innovative research methodologies and unconventional devices to understand the group's sources of income, how they get money, especially how the Islamic State or its affiliate on the continent funds the group. And we recently published a research at the George Washington University in which we detailed financial transactions of money emanating from Somalia to South Africa, then to Kenya, from where it then gets distributed to Tanzania, Uganda, and the Congo, where the ADF activities are organized. Our research was able to track at least $500,000. Many of the transactions we have been able to track their receipts and track the individuals. And so that's one aspect of defunding the group. But we do, in addition to publication, also brief government partners in the affected countries and facilitate meetings and working together between intelligence agencies. We recently held a conference in Kampala where we invited the heads of the intelligence agencies of the 7 countries in East Africa that are affected as far as finances are concerned, so they can work together. And we have been able to provide information that led to successful shutting down of the financing network that was used to transfer the 500,000 USD that we were able to track. There are other networks that are live currently, but we are continuing to track them, and that's what we are doing mostly in funding publication, briefing, and facilitating coordination between security and law enforcement agencies in the countries to cut off the finances. The second is defection messaging. And in defection messaging, we have been able to debrief at least 167 former fighters, some of them in prison, many of them defected willingly, others were arrested but got released after amnesties. So from our research with these 167 fighters, as at the last time I checked our records, we were able to estimate that at least 30% of current ISIS DRC members are willing to defect. They want to leave the group because they are disillusioned with what is happening in the bush, or because of failed promises at the time of recruitment. They were promised one thing and in the bush they met another, because of hunger, security, pressure from security forces, and a host of other reasons. And so at least 30% are willing to defect. but we identified three major things that is stopping defection. Number one is this lack of certainty on the side of group members that they will be accepted by governments and be forgiven when they come back to communities, because they know that when they come back, they may get arrested and they may rot in jail for the rest of their lives, and none of them would want to rot in jail. The second is mob action on the part of communities. Many group members have defected over the past 4 or 5 years, but they ended up getting killed in communities because communities lynch them when they come back and kill them, and therefore that's a major factor in that. And of course, the third factor is the internal threat in the group. The group itself is very close, as you know, and it has some of the severest punishment for defectors. And so in our defection messaging, we are trying to tackle these three factors, but especially the first two. The community stigmatization and mob action or lynching, and prosecution or jail or imprisonment by state forces. And so we have been working with government partners in Uganda and Congo, and in September of 2022, we were able to get the Ugandans and the Congolese government to sign what we call the standard operating procedures, SOPs, in which they covenanted to handle defectors humanely in accordance with international human rights provisions. They also agreed to exchange defectors in terms of repatriation and all that. And having got that document, then we went into the second stage, which is defection messaging. We do defection messaging in three ways. Number one, we have committees that we have formed in the frontline communities. We formed 15 Ukweli defection committees. Ukweli is truth in Swahili. And these Ukweli defection committees have several roles, but part of it is preparing communities to accept defectors through community sensitization, engaging their communities to see the importance of defection, and to humanize some of the fighters, because some of these fighters joined willingly, but many of them got abducted or tricked into the ADF. And so the Ukweli defection committees work with their communities to prepare to sensitize the communities and to make them more willing to accept defectors back, or at least stop killing the defectors. They also serve as the focal point. When defectors defect, they get handed over to the Ukweli defection committee, and then they follow our 5-step procedure to handle the defectors that may be coming out. And then the last part of the defection, of course, the Ukweli Defection Committee also does radio programs, because we have a separate project called the Community Radio, where we host members of the Ukweli Defection Committee, committee leaders, community leaders, former members, to encourage fighters to defect, but also to sensitize communities on the ADF and why defections can be an important tool in weakening the ADF. The final part of the defection messaging has to do with the ADF itself. We send radio messages to ADF fighters, to ISIS DRC fighters to leave the group. But most importantly, we do what we call flyer drops, where we hire helicopters roughly every 2 weeks to drop pamphlets in the bush. I was in Uganda 2 months ago, and I joined the helicopters and helped the team drop some of the pamphlets. On that particular occasion, we dropped 100,000 pamphlet, and we continue to drop them every 2 weeks. And the pamphlet contains straightforward message. Number one, that governments are ready to accept defectors back, or to forgive or grant amnesty if people willingly defected and turned themselves in. Number two, that communities are eager to get them back, that they would not kill them. And number three, we have a map showing routes, defection points, the 15 defection points I spoke about, with a map showing how members can defect to those areas. Of course, we also have photos of former fighters who have defected, who have been rehabilitated by us, playing football, some of them eating with their families, some of them in their places of business, to show fighters the kinds of things they might get if they defected willingly. So that's what the defection messaging campaign. And at the end of this is the DDR program, the de-radicalization, rehabilitation, and reintegration program. For that, we have a center in Kampala that currently houses 72 former fighters. We have previously graduated 74 in different batches, but this is our biggest number. We received them about 4 weeks ago after they defected at different times or got arrested at different times. So we have 72 of them right now, most of them Congolese and Ugandans, but we have a few Tanzanians and Burundians. And in that center, we have a 20-odd strong staff, experts in de-radicalization, religious counselors who understand the ideology of ISIS DRC and try to counter the ideology by working with the clients. That's what we call the defectors. And we then have a psychosocial support team led by 2 clinical psychologists and their team who try to help the clients get over their trauma, the PTSD. But also we recognized when we started receiving clients that quite a few number of them had underlying mental health issues before they joined the ADF. Some of it can be bipolar, depression, or other kinds of mental health issues which might have facilitated recruitment. So with our psychosocial support team also treats those kinds of clients. And then we have a livelihood support team that works with the clients in 3 main areas. Number 1 is livelihood itself, which is trying to skill up the clients, help them develop business plans, which we then fund when we take them back to their communities. Number 2, they teach them numeracy and literacy, or basic numeracy and literacy. Of course, then finally, they also teach them basic conflict resolution or reporting procedures and civic education in order to strengthen their relationships with the governments of their various countries. After we have finished our rehabilitation, the residential program takes like 12 weeks. And then in the meantime, we then trace clients' families. We try to rebuild the relationship between clients and their families, because some of them, the relationship had broken before they left. For some of them, they had been gone for 7 years, 10 years, some 14 years, and therefore the families might have even forgotten them. So we trace the families using information they provided us, as well as other information we got from our government partners, rebuild the relationship, and then we reinsert them back to the families. And at that point, then we continue the support. Of course, we link them up with social support services in the local communities. We then have $1,400 budget per client to help them start a business or go back to school or do whatever they want to do that we believe can help them rebuild their lives after going back to communities. So it is a 3-pronged approach: tackling the ideology, the grievances, the socio-economic or political grievances that might have driven people into the group, and then tackling the trauma they might have experienced or have gone through or have come back with because of the activities in the group or their detention at with the security forces and their mental health issues. I mean, the final point I would mention, Jacob, just let me know if I am overrunning.
Yeah, just do the final point. So we're gonna have a second round for you too.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say 2 things that are very important to us when we started this program, Jacob, and I mean, they are just logical, is that it is difficult to build trust with the clients. It takes time, it takes investment of energy and everything. But the three things we found very important is, number one, getting the enabling environment. They have suffered in the bush and some of them in detention. And so we have a lovely home in Kampala that receives them. We have 2 different centers, one for women and boys, women and children, and then one for teenagers and adult men. And so the first thing we do is to prepare the environment as much as possible to be welcoming, and our staff have been fantastic in that. We then feed them like no tomorrow, because when they come back hungry. And medical treatment, many of them come back with physical and mental health issues, and some of them with bullet wounds. Some of them come back pregnant because of the exploitation in the bush. And therefore, the first thing to do is to take care of their subsistence, their feeding, and treat them physically to bring them into the state when you can start DDR and rehabilitation. And yeah, I would just stop here. Maybe there would be some issues in the question and answer, but this is mainly what we do. And we are doing this because we believe defection, and it can be proven, is one of the main tools you can use to weaken and ultimately defeat extremist groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bulama. We're now going to do a brief second round of interventions from each panelist highlighting a specific issue. James, before he may have to run due to an urgent situation, will be discussing JNIM and ISGS in the Sahel, as well as ISWAP and JAST, otherwise known as Boko Haram in Nigeria. Daisy will then discuss the current offensive against Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Lily will discuss the situation of Boko Haram and specifically its child soldiers. And then we're going to turn back to Bulama for a final intervention, looking at the jihadist environment given recent geopolitical events. Just as a heads up, Daisy, one question that will be coming your way for your next intervention is, how can the US use counterterrorism support and partnership in Africa to leverage its opposition in strategic competition with China and Russia? So perhaps you can answer that in your next intervention. And Bulama, 2 questions for you in your next intervention. One will be, is there any amnesty mechanism for the defection? You may have addressed this to a certain extent. What type of defection process that you may have addressed that, and what form of screening is used? And also, Bulama, for you in your next intervention, a really macro issue, which I think would be great for us to close on, is how can the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict affect the diverging interests of external actors in Africa? Daisy, you might want to touch on that too. But in general, how does the situation between Israel and Hamas going to affect perhaps the jihadist ideology or the broader geopolitical situation? So now, James, for your final intervention, could you please just provide us an update on the trajectory of ISGS and JNIM in the Sahel and ISWAP and Boko Haram? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. I guess to answer your questions, bad is what I would say, in terms of the trajectory, to put it bluntly. And yes, unfortunately, I'm going to have to run, but fortunately, we have Bulama and Jacob to field any questions about Nigeria. So any people will be in very good hands. I guess, starting out very quickly on JNIM, IS Sahel, what we've seen is that whereas there had been a lot of kind of competition between the two groups since 2020, a very bloody kind of internecine fighting, that had, in some ways, it had been, kind of catastrophic from the perspective of civilian casualties and civilian harm, because actually many of the massacres committed by these terrorist groups were done so in the process of kind of competing with each other and punishing communities seen as being aligned with one or the other. But it had also been, to some extent, I think, actually part of the implicit strategy of the Sahelian states to kind of let these two groups fight it out in the hopes that that would keep them distracted. And what we've seen in the past few months, unfortunately, is that they're, at the very least, in the kind of southern parts of their kind of theaters of operation, I would say in southern and central Mali, and then down into Burkina Faso as well, they've kind of they've reduced the amount of focus that they're spending on expending on each other in terms of their kind of competition, and they're really establishing kind of separate and parallel lines of effort. So they're both conducting separate but kind of almost synchronous offensives against the different Sahelian states, and all the while they're also pushing into the coastal, the littoral states. I think Benin is the country that is most at risk and where we've seen the most activity in the past year or so. But also Togo, there are reports now as well of movement along the Ghanaian border. So many people are expecting it won't be long before Ghana experiences its first attack. And then kind of in the middle of that, there are these reports of kind of a mediation effort to kind of broker a ceasefire between some of the Katibats, the kind of particularly the Fulani-dominated divisions of Jainin and IS Sahel province at the local level. So I don't think that we're going to a point where they're actually going to like re-merge into any sort of broader, Akin Mujao type organization. The leadership of the two groups remain, drawn from kind of different constituencies and have very different interests. But I think that, one possibility in the coming months is that there will be reduced conflict between the two groups as they kind of broker some sort of tentative deconfliction, or they have some sort of kind of deconfliction mechanism, and then they focus their operations in Mali and Burkina, and now increasingly in Niger, whereas we've seen the junta is distracted. This is providing opportunities. Shifting over to Nigeria, which is where I, most of my work is, and where I've done my field work. The situation I think is kind of complex, and each year it seems to kind of change a bit, and not necessarily in the ways we expect. I think I'm actually really glad that I'm following up on Bulama, because Bridgeway does an incredibly important work, and he described a lot of the valuable work that they're doing with defectors. One of the other things, and we've seen this in the case of Nigeria, is that when defectors and those who go through DDR, are able to be accessed by researchers in ways that are kind of safe and ethical and all that. This is actually also how we get some of the best information and understandings of how these groups operate and evolve. And I think that's very much the case of what's happened with Boko Haram, where it's really been in the past few years, where you've had a couple of successful programs in Nigeria that researchers like myself are able to get some insights into kind of the different factions within Boko Haram, how these come about and how they operate. And I'm very much looking forward to Bulama's book on that matter, because I think despite the kind of hundreds of articles that have been written about Boko Haram over the past decade, some of these kind of fundamental questions about the group's origins and its orientation and all that stuff are still, these questions are still out there, in part because we're only now, starting to kind of really dig in and get to some of the sources who can shed light on this. So in terms of kind of the trajectory of Boko Haram, I call them JAS, that's their kind of official acronym, and then ISWAP, the Islamic State West Africa province, and then also the Ansaru kind of splinter group of Boko Haram that resurfaced in around 2019, 2020. The period for a time between 2016 and 2021, there was kind of the jihadist insurgency was concentrated in northeastern Nigeria, the Lake Chad Basin broadly, but Nigeria and particularly Borno State was, of course, the epicenter of the insurgency. And you had a kind of a division between between ISWAP and JAS. And there was a degree of kind of deconfliction. The groups didn't usually fight each other too much, and they largely had their own areas of operation. ISWAP was bigger and stronger and building up kind of more of a proto-state along the model of the kind of Islamic State approach. They were concentrating their attacks primarily on the military, whereas Boko Haram, under the leadership of Abu Bakr Shekau, was essentially operating as kind of, in a sense, a bandit outfit. I mean, they had their ideology, incredibly takfiri, incredibly extreme, but they were primarily surviving through predation on civilians, which they justified by their very radical notion of takfir, that any Muslim who didn't join them was essentially an apostate and therefore a valid target to kill, to rob, etc. Whereas ISWAP, and then when we saw Ansaru come up, took a kind of more strategic approach aimed both, I think, grounded both in a general or a genuine kind of theological difference, but also kind of in I think, a strategy to try to win hearts and minds among kind of these neglected, vulnerable Muslim populations in the periphery. So that all kind of started to change in 2021 when ISWAP launched an offensive into the Boko Haram stronghold in Sambisa Forest, killed Abu Bakr Shekau, or rather Shekau, detonated a suicide vest rather than surrender to ISWAP. And so then throughout 2021 and 2022, the future of JAS looked very uncertain. It kind of, there were all of these defections coming out. Many people were leaving Sambisa Forest. A lot of the jihadists were kind of turning to banditry, and some of them even moving to the Northwest, which is where I do most of my field work, or I've done a lot of my field work on this issue of kind of the bandit warlords in that part of the country. So a lot of them were either surrendering to the government or essentially just kind of becoming guns for hire. It didn't look like there was that much of a kind of coherent JAS organization to speak of. Whereas ISWAP, on the other hand, was expanding in the Northeast, moving into the former JAS strongholds in Sambisa Forest, rallying a number of JAS units to their side. And then in 2022, they actually started expanding within Nigeria. They've been laying the groundwork of this for several years. We know that they've had networks in some of these states in kind of central and northern Nigeria for several years that they've used for logistics and stuff. And they started to operationalize some of these networks to conduct attacks, including most notably within Abuja, the federal capital, where they raided a prison in July 2022, broke free some 800 inmates, and a number of whom were, 64 in particular, were former Boko Haram terrorists, some of whom then kind of joined ISWAP. So ISWAP looked very ascendant for a time. JAS kind of looked like it was on the decline. And then Ansaru also in 2021, early 2022, also looked to be ascendant. And they were essentially adopting this approach very similar to what JNIM's done in the Sahel. But in this case, they were doing it in one kind of on a much smaller level in one local government area of Kaduna State called Birnin Gwari, where they were actually, rather than kind of working with the bandits, at least publicly, which is what, a lot of the kind of jihadists have done in Nigeria, this kind of mutually beneficial ad hoc cooperation, Ansaru was making a big point of defending local villages against attacks by bandits. And that was their way of essentially trying to supplant the government and say, kind of effectively taking sides in what's something of an ethnic conflict. But, what they were doing was trying to kind of do that hearts and minds approach. Kind of gain popular support that way. So Ansaru also looked to be kind of ascendant for, I think, the start of 2022. By the end of 2022, though, and through this year, things have started to reverse for different reasons. Both ISWAP and Ansaru have kind of run out of steam in their expansionist agenda. In the case of Ansaru, it relates to the fact that I think that the terrorists were largely overwhelmed by the bandits in the region. They also relied very heavily on one particular warlord, Dogo Gide, who was kind of their benefactor, and their relationship with him, was complicated. So they ended up getting evicted from some of the territory that they had previously held by the bandits. And now the reports are kind of conflicting. I think the group is still there. They're still active, but I think that a number of the units of Ansaru have kind of turned to banditry and are kind of in this phase of being more soldiers for hire, if you will. But again, we very well may see them kind of resurface in the coming months and years, because that entire network and those individuals have not been totally dismantled, I think. But the larger group, the one that's the most concerned within Nigeria, is ISWAP. And at the same time, that they were expanding within central Nigeria, their core base in Borno State was coming under attack by a holdout group of the Boko Haram, known as the Bakura faction, which kind of sees itself and purports to be the successor to JAS and is led by this commander named Bakura. And it's very interesting. It's been very hard for a long time to get verifiable information on this group, especially kind of in the middle of all of these conflicts and stuff. But what appears to have happened now is that Bakura was actually very successful in starting in December 2022 with launching some big attacks in ISWAP and actually taking territory from them on the Lake Chad Basin. And this is interesting because, among other things, it shows that Bakura was not actually interested in ISWAP's, what is arguably a more kind of, in some ways, successful and strategic approach of kind of establishing an insurgency based on a pseudo-bureaucratic structure with rules and regulations and taxation and all of that stuff. What it shows is that a sizable percentage of Boko Haram or kind of jihadist commanders and fighters actually preferred to some extent the Shekau style of kind of raiding freely and banditry and all of that stuff. So ISWAP has actually lost a lot of territory in recent months, and they're now, you can see this in the number of their claimed operations, the scale of those operations. They're more confined within Borno State than they were before. They're certainly not defeated, but they are in a weaker state than they were about a year ago. I think simultaneously, largely for different reasons, is kind of my assessment, but their expansion in central Nigeria has also kind of run out of steam, at least temporarily. And I think that comes partially has to do with the dynamics of some of these jihadist networks that they co-opted in Kogi State, which is something that Jacob can talk about. You detail it extensively in your book, the history of that there. So we're now in an interesting position where JAS is actually, of those three groups, JAS appears to actually be the ascendant one, whereas Ansaru and ISWAP for now are facing challenges. That said, I mean, the Boko Haram conflict is very complex. It's full of surprises. Where things will stand in 6 months or a year, you can map out potential scenarios, but I think that goes beyond the scope of this discussion. So thank you very much. And as I said, please, any Nigeria-related questions, Bulama and Jacob are exceptionally well equipped to handle. So thanks again, though, Jacob, for hosting me, and to everyone for tuning in, and of course to my fellow panelists for their very interesting insights.
Thank you very much, James. And indeed, Boko Haram, that issue has been covered by Orion before, so please do check out the website, orionpolicy.org, ORION policy.org. And we will have future writings on Nigeria in context of the coup in Niger on the website, as well as other very current developments around the world, such as several expert panels on the Hamas-Israel conflict. They're also available on the website. So I highly encourage the audience to check out the website, orionpolicy.org. Now we're going to turn the floor for the final brief interventions and then a concluding intervention from Bulama. The first of these final interventions will be from Daisy on the offensive against al-Shabaab, and also responding to the question about USCT support and partnership in Africa, especially in light of the competition with Russia and China. So Daisy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will answer the second question later, and then first provide the brief, if that's all right. Regarding the current offensive in Somalia, this is an area where I've done most of my field work. And in terms of, I'm going to look at it in 3 ways, in terms of the background and current status of the offensive, and then quickly talk about some of the challenges and successes the offensive has happened, and the feasibility for the next steps for the offensive. So, the offensive was launched in August 2022 when the president of the Somali government declared a total war on al-Shabaab and launched this new offensive against the group. As it currently stands, the government is struggling somewhat to complete its first phase of the offensive in the central regions of Somalia, particularly the member states of Galmudug and Hirshabelle. However, the government has a very ambitious plan to defeat the group in its strongholds in the southern regions of the country by the end of next year, 2024. And as part of the second phase of the offensive, they have an even more ambitious plan that was stated by the president in August 17th of this year, that they declared that his government would eliminate al-Shabaab or diminish its influence down to only a small set of pockets in the next 5 months. So this is really the current state of affairs. Now, this planned second phase of the offensive is intended to occur in the federal member states of Southwest State and Jubaland, towards the southern parts of the country. And the second phase of the offensive is also coined Operation Black Lion, and is expected to draw roughly 20 to 30,000 additional troops from Kenya, Ethiopia, and Djibouti to bolster the Somali forces. So in light of this, the current offensive in the central regions of the Somalia and the planned offensive towards the southern parts of the country, it is worth examining some of the backgrounds around the offensive, some of the successes and challenges, and what that means for the future prospects of the offensive. In terms of the current status of the offensive, in contrast to previous offensives that were mostly led by international organization or international forces, the current offensive is spearheaded exclusively by the federal government, fighting alongside local clans. Now, a unique set of events provided the circumstances essential to the government's advance. In particular, al-Shabaab's coercive and repressive tactics in the central regions of the country antagonized local clans, particularly the Habagadir and Seleban subclans as well as the Hawadle. And this antagonization largely happened in Galmudug and Hirshabelle, the central parts of the country. And this ended up generating resentment and provoked militia from the communities to organize and push back against the group around the summer of 2022. So at the same period of time, or like really shortly after, in August of 2022, the al-Shabaab also conducted a well-known attack against this hotel known as the Hyatt Hotel in Mogadishu, and it took the government forces 30 hours to quell, and it ended up costing about 20 lives as a result of the attack. So these events, this growing frustration against Al-Shabaab amongst local clans in the central regions, as well as this major attack in Mogadishu and mounting criticisms of the government's response to the hotel siege, created the opportunity for the government to deploy armed forces to Hiran to fight alongside the Hawadli clan militias in August 2022. So it's really the clan organic uprisings that really set things off for this offensive. Now, by October of 2022, the government forces as well as militia had recaptured much of Al-Shabaab's territory in Hiran, in the east of the Shabelle region. This is in the Hirshabelle state. And so they wanted to capitalize on these early gains. And so the government forces and militia expanded their offensive into the Galmudug region. The United States has been providing some support for in the form of weapons and ammunition, as well as airstrikes in support of the government's offensive, and so too has Turkey in terms of providing drone strikes. In terms of the successes the offensive has had thus far, it is fair to say that at this current stage, the government's offensive in Hirshabelle and Galmudug has yielded what some have described as the most substantial territorial gains against Al-Shabaab since the mid-2010s. You can see this in the recapturing of very key strategic territory. In April of this year, ACLED estimated around 215 locations had been recaptured by the government. And some of these locations include in December 2022, the recapture of an Al-Shabaab regional center of operations in Middle Shabelle known as Adan Yaba. In January 2023, the government offensive also successfully recaptured strategic towns in Galmudug, and similarly we saw recapturing of other strategic territories in places like Awabo and Elbur in Galgudud. So certainly there have been those successes. In addition to the fact that collaborating with clan militias has helped the government strengthen ties with local communities, particularly in rural areas, which has been quite useful in the central region. But, despite these successes, the current offensive is experiencing several notable challenges that have diminished some of the initial optimism that characterized the early gains of the offensive in the fall and early spring of the year. Certainly, a lot of authors have really done a really good job of articulating this. In fact, James, who had to step away, has a recent article that came out in the Hudson Institute just around this issue, as well as Samira Gaid and Stig Hansen. But in terms of just articulating the challenges that they're facing, the first one would be the fact that despite losing key territory, Al-Shabaab has remained incredibly capable of conducting attacks and projecting its power into areas that it has lost. In January of this year alone, Al-Shabaab deployed at least 12 vehicle-borne IEDs in towns in central Somalia. And in one of these attacks in Galmudug state, in a place called Galkad, they managed to hit the Danab special strike unit that is usually trained by the United States. And by hitting this force in the area, the force ended up experiencing significant losses, including its deputy commander. This single attack set back the offensive in the subsequent weeks. They've also managed to hit the clan militias present in the Hiran region of Hirshabelle. And in May of 2023, they also managed to hit Somali forces in the Galmudug state. So they're hitting across the two locations where the government offensives have occurred. In August of this year, they conducted a deadly attack on a recently recaptured village in Galgudud that caused government forces to retreat from the towns and villages it had captured in recent months, signifying a big setback in the offensive. But I think what has been most notably noticed in the offensive is, and largely captured by Caleb Wise's analysis, is that in September of 2023, they conducted several major attacks in Hiran, including truck bomb attacks in the town of Beledweyne and suicide attacks in Bouloubarde town. And these attacks sort of marked the highest number of suicide bombings conducted by Al-Shabaab in a single month since 2006. So you can see that Al-Shabaab has been very capable of hitting back against the offensive. A second challenge that the offensive is facing currently is the risk that the clan militia could potentially pose to the long-term stability in the region. So in areas recovered from Al-Shabaab, local communities will inevitably seek to benefit from the vacuum that is created, which could result in broader clan conflicts over governance and control of liberated territories. The challenge that's facing the government at this current moment is not only on how to continue to mobilize local clan communities against Al-Shabaab, but how to do so in a way that avoids stoking clan rivalries and fragmentation that ultimately will undermine security and ultimately just benefit Al-Shabaab that tends to take advantage of these clan tensions. A third challenge that is facing Al-Shabaab, and that one that has been noted by a lot of observers, is the lack of a clear holding and building strategy. The offensive has thus far proved capable of clearing Al-Shabaab from territories in central Somalia, but it has yet to articulate a clear strategy that clarifies the role that which forces will be responsible for holding recovered areas and the role that clan militias will play in this particular structure. And, this lack of holding power is a recurring issue. Several key cities, towns, villages spread across central and southern Somalia have exchanged hands between various armed groups that include the government, its partner forces, Al-Shabaab, and community militias. You can look at examples from Adan Yabal in Middle Shabelle, which the government forces recently recaptured in December 2022. But if you look at it historically, who has held that particular area, you can see that it has experienced multiple changes in control since 2016. If you look at Wabho in Galgudud, this has also experienced multiple changes in control since 2014 between Ethiopian troops and Al-Shabaab. And more recently, in August of this year, government forces and clan militia did successfully capture the strategic Runigur district, a major Al-Shabaab hub in Middle Shabelle. But only 2 weeks later, Al-Shabaab recaptured the territory from the group. So, these exchanges of control sort of underscore a pattern of, temporary victories and quick losses for the government. A fourth challenge that is very much tied to this inability to hold recovered territory is a lack of a strong government presence in recent recaptured territories, which leaves locals hesitant to collaborate with the government. So residents really fear facing Al-Shabaab retribution once the government leaves. So in rural areas of Hiran and other regions, some sub-clans have considered it necessary to reach agreements with Al-Shabaab for their own safety. So these agreements reportedly stipulate that the communities will not participate in the ongoing offensive in Hiran, and in return, Al-Shabaab will offer them a peace deal. And so we see examples of this in December 2022, when clan elders from the Habegadir and Saleban sub-clans in the town in Mudug region reached an agreement with Al-Shabaab on this matter. And meanwhile, in April of this year, Al-Shabaab maintained that it had made similar agreements with certain sub-clans based in the Buloborto district. So this is a rising concern. And the fifth and last challenge that the offensive is currently facing is concerns over the regional government's appetite for engaging in the offensive. There have been rumors that perhaps the three countries that are meant to intervene in the second half of the offensive, that is Kenya, Ethiopia, and Djibouti, may not be having the same appetite to engage in the offensive as is previously been set forth. In fact, in August of this year, a Somali army commander did say that it did not appear to him as though the troops from Djibouti, Kenya, and Ethiopia would have, and I quote, an immediate direct participation, though Kenya defense officials indicated their position had not changed and that they were still committed to the operation. But this still raises certain concerns. And so as we sort of turn our focus to the government's stated plans to launch the second phase of the offensive into Shabaab strongholds in the southern parts of the region and be able to defeat the group by the end of next year, really some of these challenges become even more acute when we start to focus on the southern regions. It makes it very worrying to determine whether or not the second phase is going to have its intended impact. For instance, at the end of March of this year, the president, Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, announced that the launch of the second phase of the military offensive was about to start. But due to increased pushback from al-Shabaab in central territories, particularly in Hirshabelle, the government forces have remained focused on securing their gains in the central regions in this second phase, rather than moving towards southwestern Jubaland. Moreover, it's hard to imagine that the government will be able to replicate the offensive it has currently done in the central parts of the government in the southern parts of the territories. For one, the spontaneous and organic clan uprising against al-Shabaab that emerged in central regions is unlikely to occur across al-Shabaab strongholds due to a long-lasting and very complex and combustible clan dynamics in the regions and long-standing grievances between them. There's also questions about if there is an offensive in these territories and certain territories are liberated in the south. There's questions about who will hold and who will govern these territories, especially because of how combustible the political rivalries tend to be in those regions, whether you're talking about tensions between the Ghetto and Ghetto region of Jubaland, as well as the regional administration in Jubaland that is based in the southern part of Jubaland, known as Kismayo. Those tensions lead to more of a fragmented potential for the offensive to move forward. If you're talking about Southwest State, they also have their own regional tensions, particularly around this next political cycle that is coming up in November, and tensions between opposition and ruling governing force in the area. So it raises a lot of questions for the need for some sort of political settlement and political reconciliation to occur in the southern parts of the country before any offensive can really take root. I won't talk more because and I'm certain maybe I don't want to take too much time. I think there is the question from, I think it was, forgive me, I'm going to scroll back. Is it the question, and how can the Israeli-Hamas conflict question, or which one?
I think Ghulam will address the Hamas one. So if you could just briefly touch on U.S. partnerships, because we're over time, just U.S. partnerships and how they can be leveraged in light of competition with Russia and China, and just 2 minutes or so. Do you have a main point on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a big question. I think a good example is, understanding the nature of the conflicts on the ground. I think Bulamo did a really great, make a really great point in talking about the defections in terms of understanding what got people in and sort of how to get people out of the groups. And that certainly provides an understanding of, if you understand the conflict, then there's a better place to sort of help respond to the nature of the threat. If you look at in the case of Somalia, the government has, the US has decided to, rightfully support the federal government's interventions, but also acknowledging that this needs to be a Somali-led initiative, not necessarily imposing their own position on things. And I think when you look at in the other areas where I think Russia is more present on this, where they have intervened to counter violent extremism in other parts of the continent, their record is not as successful. Or even if you look at in Mozambique, the Russians weren't particularly successful with the Wagner operations. So it's sort of understanding the nature of the conflict and understanding how to respond to it is really important, which can then calibrate how USCT support looks like, as is seen in Somalia.
Thank you, Daisy. Thank you very much. Audience, please keep in mind, now's the time to send in your questions. Rather than having a formal Q&A session after the panels, we're including the questions into the interventions themselves. As we turn towards the end of this broader webinar, it's important to look towards the future. And one topic that may be overlooked is that of child soldiers, since for certain insurgencies, they very much are the future, and in some cases, they even are the present because they're fighting. So I'm gonna turn over the floor to Lily, who's gonna discuss Boko Haram child soldiers, and then we're gonna turn to Bulama, who's gonna provide some final remarks in addition to answering several questions. So Lily, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jacob. So I'm going to be speaking briefly about some more formal research, a recent article that I co-authored actually with Jacob, as well as Zacharias and Mary Jane Fox, which looks at Boko Haram's child soldier use. And we primarily looked at, it was visual ethnographic review, and we looked at kind of all depictions of children within Boko Haram, both factions of ISWAP and JAST, from 2009 to 2021, which included over 30 videos and photo sets. And within that, we looked at children who were under the age of 15. And we were able to code their depictions into four main thematic categories, and into a combination of sometimes staged and sometimes non-staged content. The four categories that emerged were around Chibok, the Chibok girls, which were, of course, videos of the captured Chibok girls, combat and training, which included male child soldiers in active battle and military drills, media mujahids, which were boys in media-related roles, and then Eid depictions, which were festivities and holidays, religious gatherings, kind of communal prayers and communal meals. So just go through briefly on kind of key findings related to the depictions in those four categories. So again, the first, looking at Chibok, we initially looked at kind of how gender within child soldiering for Boko Haram, and found that the only times that you see images or depictions of female child soldiers are really with Chibok. However, the Chibok girls were, all of the content was staged media, such as this photo here. And more of the timing of it was around the negotiations for Chibok girl release. And so we see that it's not likely, we have nothing to suggest that their girls are actually being used in conflict or combat, and staged or brought into depictions of other child soldiers, so that it appears that Boko Haram kind of keeps depictions of child soldiers to only male child soldiers, which would be in line with also how they depict male soldiers overall, and don't have older women also in their depictions. We looked at in training and combat. This is one of the most common roles. Here we saw a divide between the way that children were depicted in staged content versus non-staged. In staged content, Boko Haram strove to emulate ISIS's use of child soldiers, which is to depict them as a future threat with a much higher level of organization, including age stratified training with separate uniforms and particular choreography. Also their use for kind of extreme violence and shock propaganda, such as executions. Whereas in non-staged content, we actually see that fighting is much more integrated, and that child soldier use in training and combat is not restricted to these kind of extreme violent moments, but also used just in daily kind of roles, more mundane things, including cooking or anything else. And the one factor here is, it was interesting to see that, so after Shekau and Jas kind of split from ISWAP, they actually continued to emulate the IS style use of child soldiers in their videos, including the choreography and nasheeds, etc. So interesting to see that the use of child soldiers and kind of the stylization of use is one attribute of influence from IS to an affiliate group that may outlast their actual allegiance. Looking at media mujahids, these were images and videos of youth depicting some sort of media role for verbal jihad. We found that youth are very often included in these videos, in these images, and are honored as martyrs alongside adults, which we felt can be attributed to the generational advantage that youth have in understanding media technology and social media platforms. So this may actually be a kind of a key role for youth within the group. Looking at the final category, which is around Eid and holidays, we had both staged and non-staged content showing how the factions celebrated these holidays or other communal events together. which highlighted really a core finding for the article around how child soldiers are integrated into the Boko Haram societies. And the way in which they're honored sometimes, for example, in this video, at even the front of those communal events, reciting a prayer or standing alongside another leader. And this is an interesting finding because in the content, you can see that there's quite a number of women, children, both boys and girls, kind of all mixed in for these communal events, which kind of depicts integrating entire jihadi families into the factions, which is not just kind of ideologically important for the groups who are trying to promote an idea that they could foster social unity and govern territory, but also it was noticeable because it indicated that these might be families that are living within the territory governed by Boko Haram, meaning that children born into that context may be endogenously recruited. So that takes me to the kind of three main implications. Like I said, the first is really around this idea of endogenous child soldier recruitment. And this is kind of an interesting concept to look out for the chance that when other groups also get to a stage of being able to hold territory and include families integrated within their society, we can expect that those groups might also be able to leverage children through this endogenous style recruitment. The second is that if that does happen in other cases, and with Boko Haram, there's an implication for kind of how we think about countering and connecting somewhat on points 2 and 3 to Boulama's presentation. This has a big implication for how we think about defections and de-radicalization. So normally you might do like community level activities external to the group, but if there's endogenous recruitment, then engaging with those communities won't stem the internal recruitment. And third and finally, you then have implications for the type of combatant off-ramps and kind of post-conflict de-radicalization support that would be needed if these are children who have grown up potentially their entire lives only known within kind of the jihadist society and having experienced significant amount of trauma. The de-radicalization process would be potentially much more expensive. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Lily, for highlighting a key issue of concern that's often overlooked, but that is definitely relevant for the future of Nigeria's counterinsurgency and the continent more broadly, because other theaters are facing similar issues. So now we're going to turn over the floor to Boulama, who will provide not only his second and final intervention, but what will become essentially concluding remarks for this webinar. And I would just want to preface it by noting that we've seen major changes in the jihadist ideological landscape over the last 5 years, from the fall of ISIS in Syria to the conquest of Kabul by the Taliban. And now we're seeing a lot of sympathy for an Islamist militant group, Hamas, at least in a global perspective, and its conflict with Israel. Will this have an effect on the ideologies of African militant groups? And also looking towards the future, and based on some of these questions, Boulama, can you also provide some of the best case scenarios? Although the situation looks bleak now, what are some of the best case scenarios that you can see for Nigeria and the Sahel? Because we've had some questions on that. And then just another question that maybe you can address is, to what extent have these insurgencies sort of become just insurgency as a way of life, as a way of economic organization, which to me speaks of the issue of them becoming very metastasized and very hard to root out. So if you can provide some of these final remarks, it would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, sure. I am cognizant of the fact that we have run over time, but I will try to be brief so we can release everyone to go on with the rest of their days or evenings. The first thing I would say when it comes to violent extremism in Africa is that, I mean, from the presentations we have seen today, one will be overwhelmed. We have been talking about Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Mozambique, the DRC, Sahel, the Lake Chad region, and elsewhere, of course, Mauritania and others. But one thing I want us to take away, which I hope would be reassuring, is the fact that these crises are spread across Africa, but let's remember that they occupy small areas of land in each of the territories we are mentioning. It is not it is not an unsolvable issue. It is a problem that we can conquer and solve if there is the political will and the determination to do that. It is not the whole of the Sahel or the Lake Chad region or Mozambique or the DRC. It is just small areas of those countries that are affected by this crisis. Now, when it comes to the groups, Jacob, to speak to the ideology, when it comes to the groups in Africa, you can broadly classify them into three. We have those who are affiliated to Al-Qaeda, those who are affiliated to ISIS, and the groups that are independent. And James and Daisy, even Lily, has touched on some of these groups and their affiliations. I don't need to go back to start listing which is where and how. But one thing I would point out is that for those that are ISIS affiliate, which are the biggest on the continent, especially in the in Eastern Africa, that's in the case of the DRC and in the Lake Chad region, except that Jazz is bouncing back to life recently. I mean, almost all the groups in Africa predate ISIS, and many of them either were formed before Al-Qaeda became a global thing, or even before Al-Qaeda was known in some of the places. And I am saying this so that we understand that these were groups that emanated from local context, and they have local agenda and local recruitment and mobilization strategy. That doesn't mean they haven't been inspired by groups elsewhere. And that's the point I will come to when we come to the conversation around the Palestinian situation. And even when they became allied to ISIS, they did not have a uniform modus operandi. They had the same overarching ideology, but not the same or even similar mode of operation. For example, ISIS in the Lake Chad region, ISWAP does not target civilians. They actively work to avoid civilian casualties. They even protect civilians against Jazz. But ISIS in Mozambique, ISIS in the DRC targets civilians. And sometimes we see them not targeting them in order to try to win their support. Or ISGS, or the Islamic State in Sahara province, it actively targets civilians, even though it was supposed to be under ISWAP, which does not target civilians. So the ideology is the same. And if you looked at the ideology, you could say even ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates had the same the same overarching ultimate objective, which is the establishment of their own version of Islamic law after getting rid of Western influence or Western inspired democracies or systems of governments. But then, even though the ideology is the same, it is the strategy or the tactic that changed. And that's why when we saw the changes you were talking about, Jacob, around the fall of Kabul or the takeover in Afghanistan, what I would say happened was change in tactic or even recruitment strategy. It is using or exploiting those events in order to feed their recruitment strategy, just like they did during COVID. But one key change in strategy that was inspired both locally and externally is this realization by violent extremist groups in Africa, maybe with the exception of Al-Shabaab, that it is difficult, if not impossible, to capture and administer cities. Boko Haram tried it when they captured Nigeria's territory the size of Belgium and tried to establish their state, but they soon realized that they are not skilled in urban warfare, and therefore they were dismantled and dislodged and dismantled from the area and were pushed to the fringes of the Lake Chad region. And so my assessment, my view is that these groups have stopped trying to capture cities and administer them. What they have rather resorted to is this semi-territorial presence. by which they retreat to rural areas and then attack urban areas and flee. And the objective is, number one, to establish their control over those areas so they can exploit them to collect taxes. They can exploit them for information and stuff like that by inspiring fear, by terrorizing them. But they know that they cannot capture and administer them. They cannot fight the conventional militaries in African countries in an urban warfare. So they have retreated to their insurgencies. And I don't think there is appetite by any of them to capture any capital or any big city and try to administer it. And therefore, their playbook is causing as sufficient instability as possible to make countries ungovernable and to expose democracies as unviable. And this playbook has played out very well in the Sahel. When we talk about the coups that James talked about in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, what we don't take a step back to consider is the role of jihadi groups or so-called jihadi groups. Because each of the militaries that took over in those countries, the first thing they mentioned as their reason for taking over is insecurity, inability of democratic states to tackle or confront jihadi groups in the countries. And what did we see after military takeover? We saw sporadic protests in support of the military in almost all the countries where we saw that. And the people that were out on the street were saying the democratic governments were unable to keep us safe from these groups. And so it is this jihadi groups playbook of causing instability that is playing out. And then what did we see after that? We saw instability in terms of sanctions. When you sanction communities and cause economic problems amongst communities, that makes them more poorer. It makes them more vulnerable to recruitment by violent extremist groups and makes them less loyal to the government that is ineffective in the first place, but is now facing sanctions, economic sanctions and political sanctions, and therefore becoming even more ineffective. And then we saw the Russians withdrawing. I mean, the French withdrawing. Now the United Nations is withdrawing. The peacekeeping mission in Mali is withdrawing. Their timetable is to conclude withdrawal by December. They are going to leave a huge vacuum. We talk about Russia and Wagner, but we know that Russia does not have the political will to keep these countries safe. It doesn't even have the capacity after what is going on in Ukraine. And now if Russia turns its attention to the Palestinian issue, assuming Iran gets involved, there will be even less appetite on the part of Russia to secure the Sahel, or they would not even have the capacity to do it. And the only person that will fill that vacuum are these groups, the violent extremist group, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates in the territories. And so this political instability, the economic sanctions, the coups, the withdrawals, the open fighting we see between France and its colonies is benefiting no one but these groups that are enemies of the countries, their host countries, and are enemies of the West. And finally, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, and that's where I would stop, Jacob. I say these groups are local. All the groups in Africa are local or started locally, but they were all inspired by activities and groups in the Middle East and ideologues in the Middle East. And one key point of recruitment has always been the Palestinian situation. We have seen them using videos of past attacks or statements on Palestine or the Iraq war and others. And we saw how they exploited the fall of Kabul and how they celebrated it across Africa and use it as an inspiration to show their fighters that there can be victory after decades of fighting. So keep fighting because the Taliban has succeeded. We are going to succeed. Now, the more humanitarian catastrophe we see in Gaza, the more babies that get killed in Gaza, the more clips that will be used by groups in Africa to recruit even more people and to inspire even more people. And as Jacob said, we have seen widespread condemnation of what is happening, especially in the Muslim populations. And if the Muslim populations continue to see the hypocrisy of the West in supporting Israel and saying we want to take humanitarian assistance to Gaza, but they are doing nothing to actualize that, if babies in incubators start to die in Gaza, you will see mass recruitment by groups that are enemies of the West, enemies of us who are mainstream Muslims, and enemies of everyone who wants to live in peace. And so, I mean, for me, it is a question of exploitation. It may not change their ideology, but it's certainly going to fit their recruitment strategy. And they would use clips, they would use news stories, they would use statements from Israeli leaders, from Joe Biden, from Rishi Sunak, to try to paint a picture, maybe, I mean, a non-genuine picture of an Islam that is under attack from the West and that Muslims must rally around to defend. And that has always been their strategy, but now they are getting something even more tangible. And that's why I think it is important for countries in the West who feel fighting Hamas and uprooting Hamas as the only way to do it in a way that does not portray them as targeting the Palestinian population. As we know, that area has deep history in all the three major religions, including Islam. And many Muslims across the world will see that targeting the Palestinians and the destruction of their homes as targeting them on account of their faith. And maybe majority of the mainstream Muslims will only condemn it openly or in their hearts, but jihadis would use it to recruit people, and they can get candidates, especially passionate, unemployed young people who are ignorant of Islam but are passionate about it. I would stop here, Jacob. Hopefully I am not ending on a glib note.
No, thank you. You're ending on a passionate note, and you touched on a lot of key themes that also highlighted the key topics from the other presentations. So it was a very suitable, comprehensive, and knowledgeable concluding remark for this webinar. I thank you, Bulama, as well as Daisy, Lily, and James for sharing your research and your insights. I hope this benefited the audience, who has provided some very excellent questions. I hope that most, if not all of them, have been answered by the panelists. I encourage all of the audience to tune into the upcoming works, books, reports, and research from the panelists, as well as OPI. Again, you can check ORION policy.org for the latest research and writings from Orion, various webinars, various analytical articles, including touching on Hamas, Gaza, and Israel, as well as African security issues. So once again, it's noontime, time for lunch for people on the East Coast, bedtime for people tuning in from elsewhere. We thank you again for your time, for your research, for this incredibly insightful panel, and we wish you all a pleasant rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.